A few years ago, a buddy of mine and I were browsing our local GameStop when we came across this game called Senran Kagura, Estival Versus. It was the Endless Summer Edition, which comes with a handful of bonus stuff and was priced, I think, at $50. On a whim, we split the price of the game and brought it home to play. We weren't expecting much, it looked pretty silly, but we ended up having a pretty good time with it, and since then, I've always had a low-key interest in what the franchise has to offer. At some point while I was playing recently, I thought to myself that it might be fun to try and review all three of the PS4 games. I'll be honest, I'm not a particularly huge fan of Senran Kagura or anything. I play them pretty casually, so this won't be a super extensive deep dive into everything about these games like some of my other stuff, but these games do tend to go under the radar in terms of coverage and reviews, so I thought it would be a fun video to try out. I'm going to be talking about them in the order that I recently played them, starting with PBS, then Burst Renewal, and finally Estival Versus. And without further ado, let's begin. Going back to these games, I really wasn't sure what to expect. I remember enjoying Estival Versus and PBS when I first played them a while back, but I was pretty uncertain of how they would hold up, especially PBS. PBS is an arena-style third-person shoot-'em-up, and overall I had a really good time with it despite its handful of issues. This game has a very healthy amount of content, including single and multiplayer modes, the former of which has 3 modes to play through. I can't comment on the multiplayer since I haven't played it and don't really have any interest in it. I've always been more of a single-player guy. Sorry. Plus, I can't imagine that the servers are even that active, at least not over here in North America. That being said, I've always enjoyed co-op survival modes like COD Zombies and the Uncharted co-op arenas, so I imagine it would work really well with a game like this that's already built around arena-style combat. The first of PBS's single-player modes is the Story, where you can play as one of the 4 main shinobi groups through the PBS tournament. The first issue I have with this game comes from the fact that each of these arcs plays out with their own respective team winning the tournament, meaning that what's ultimately canon is up in the air. This might be a weird comparison, but it reminded me of Resident Evil 2, and its multiple scenarios that are canonically incongruent with one another. I'm not really sure why they structured it this way, at least with the campaign mode specifically, but if I had to guess at which one was canon, I would assume it's the Gessen arc. The only real basis I have for this is that Yumi seems to be the poster girl / main character of the franchise, but again, that's pretty much my only reason for assuming this, and I very well could be wrong. Once all 4 of the arcs have been beaten, a 5th will be unlocked, which follows up on the main plot thread that's been teased throughout the duration of the other arcs. And unlike the first 4 arcs, which were all 10 missions respectively, the P1 Climax arc is 14 missions. After completing it, one last arc will be unlocked, which only features a single mission where you fight the final boss. I'm not really sure why this one boss got its own quote-unquote arc, entirely dedicated to them, but whatever. You could have just put it in the P1. If I had to pick a favorite arc, it would easily be the P1 Climax. It felt more distinct compared to the others, and you can tell they really try to do a bit more with structuring the missions themselves, such as having one where you play it completely solo rather than having a squad. The 4 main arcs all follow a very similar structure that got a bit too samey and repetitive. They all feature identical starting missions. Each of them features a mission where you have to put out some fires, Mission 4 tends to be a single character boss fight, and the tournament always ended at Mission 9, with Mission 10 serving as a boss battle. That last one doesn't bother me too much though, as the boss fights are unique and pose interesting challenges. I honestly think Senran Kagura as a whole does boss fights pretty damn well. I wouldn't call them exceptional, but they always offer a unique twist on the established mechanics and generally have very little in the ways of flaws. As you can guess, each mission has a set list of playable characters. However, upon completion and replay, you can actually pick whatever characters you want for that mission, which is a really effective way of encouraging replays on higher difficulties. It doesn't add new dialogue or anything, but at least I can go back and stick with the best girls when I'm doing my replays. Senran Kagura is a series all about picking your favorite characters. Everyone has their own unique quirks and qualities that make them appeal to different types of players, though I wouldn't say PBS does the best job at following through with this, and this is probably my biggest criticism of the game. For starters, every character feels very Flanderized when it comes to the story, which is a common trope in long-running series like this, especially so in more fanservice-y products like PBS, where it's meant to be more of a fun go-through of the franchise and what fans took to along the way. For those who don't know, Flanderization is when you take one quality of a character and blow it out of proportion to make that character more of an embodiment of that quality, rather than that quality simply being a single aspect of the character's personality. There are actually a few really nice moments between some of these characters, one of the most notable for me being Ikarigo's struggle to come to terms with the eventual parting of her friends. I think that's a relatable conflict that just about any young person will be able to relate to, but more often than not, any tension or drama in a scene is going to be overshadowed by overly flirtatious banter that doesn't always stick, Asuka and Homura being aggressively competitive rivals, or how Murakumo is confident with her mask on but a complete ditz when it comes off, to name a few. But the issue with characters not feeling as distinct as they could isn't just limited to the story. See, here's the thing. In games like Estival Versus and Burst Renewal, even if attacks and combos can feel very samey at times, the animations allow for the characters to stand out, which lends to the idea of giving the characters a wide variety of appealing factors. In the other games, everyone has a unique weapon and fighting style that helps them stand out. Ikagura has her badass long katana that borderline plagiarizes Virgil's Yamato, Yagyu has a goddamn parasol, Rin has her blades that she can combine into a massive windmill shuriken, Haruka has a fucking robot, Homura has her 6 blades with the 7th being a supremely powerful fire sword that she only uses in intense circumstances. These characters are badasses. PBS being a shooter means that every character is functionally going to be identical without the implementation of unique abilities and weapons. But the only things in PBS that really separate one character from another is how they look and their single melee attack, which is a real shame. You'd think that each character would have their own unique guns and abilities, but that's just not the case. Hell, Mirai quite literally has her own gun in the other games, but even that doesn't carry over. I'd love an umbrella that also functions as a gun weapon. Hell, why doesn't Haruka's robot come mounted with water cannons? There was a lot of potential here to have some unique and inventive weaponry, but instead all the weapons are pretty archetypal firearms like pistols, assault rifles, and rocket launchers to name a few. As well, all of the weapons in PBS are accessible for every character, and all abilities can be assigned to any character. The only true mechanical differences between characters are the melee attacks, but that's a single animation with pretty minor differences in the lot. I suppose the counter to this criticism would be that having every character be just as viable as one another encourages the player to decide on their favorites and gives them the freedom to play however they want, but my counter to that would be that the character is no longer earning their fanfare and credibility, and rather that the devs are just leaving that kind of thing to our whims. The reason anyone is going to love the characters they do is because that character did something to impress them. People don't just love Liara from Mass Effect because she's cute and blue and has an enormous cock. People love her because she's an invaluable ally and unendingly loyal to Shepard, whether that be as a friend or something more. And sure, PBS does have its fair share of character moments that can help. In fact, there are some moments that are genuinely wholesome, but most of it feels more like running gags or the same old, rather than meaningful development or standout highlights. The general gameplay loop is pretty good for the most part. Missions typically see the player and their squad going up against hordes of jobbers or another shinobi squad, with a handful of pretty cool boss fights to cap off each arc. The jobber enemies are rarely a threat, but in certain combinations they can pose some interesting challenges that actually require the player to think about how they want to approach the mission, which is a huge plus given how the player has to decide for themselves what they take into the missions. Story mode typically won't require too much thought from the player until they reach the 5th arc, and even then that's only on hard mode, but the Paradise episodes do a pretty good job at pushing the player into trying different strats. That being said, there are skill cards that grossly outclass others, and certain weapon types are pretty bad, so there's little incentive to go beyond the most powerful gear and skills once you've figured out what they are. Hint: the assault rifle is insanely powerful. I think the most fun I had was when I was fighting the other shinobi squads. They pose a very genuine threat, and if you let them catch you off guard, they'll kick your ass. They hold nothing back, and more or less have everything the player can use at their disposal. It basically feels like a multiplayer mode within a single player mode, and depending on the given and selected abilities for the enemies in your squad respectively, the amount of tactical thought that can go into the harder fights is surprisingly thorough. These harder missions won't just require relative skill in the moment-to-moment gameplay. The player is going to need to put some major thought into how they structure their team. If there's one thing this game does very well though, it's easily the unlock system and character customization. Character customization is something that pretty much anyone can get behind. I mean, it's basically the selling point for games like Code Vein, and PBS does a pretty excellent job at allowing the player to dress up each and every character however they may desire. You'll probably notice that I changed how almost everyone looked between my playthroughs of the various arcs. Not only did I just want to try out different looks for everyone, but the game did a great job at encouraging me by rewarding me with so much by the end of each arc, even on the lower difficulties. There was definitely never an excess in rewards, but there was always just enough that I could pick up a few items from the shop to play around with. Combine that with the unlocks from the missions themselves, and I was able to do quite a bit even before getting that far into my first arc. I do wish the weapons themselves and these assist items had a bit more customization to them, but I will admit that the upgraded weapons look pretty badass. I just wish that the developers had at least come up with some unique weapon skins. I mean, it's already a shame that nobody has their own weapons, but not being able to stand out even on a visual level is a real shame given this franchise's legacy. Aside from the story mode, there's a set of side missions that I assume are non-canonical called Paradise episodes, which are sets of missions centered around the different characters and their various misadventures. Some of these missions are pretty unique too, with some interesting stipulations that help to make them feel distinct from the main story and its repetitive structure. The final mode is V-Road, which is an actual tournament-style mode with 4 ladders to progress through. Think Mortal Kombat towers. This is a pretty cool addition that offers a solid challenge and can be pretty rewarding. There's basically nothing in terms of character interactions, which feels a bit weird for Senran Kagura, but given that we already have 2 whole modes with loads of unique interactions between just about any and all possible combinations of characters, I won't complain too much, but it is weird. Overall, PBS is a pretty fun time. It's not outstanding by any means, and it's definitely held back by an overabundance of flanderization, as well as some design choices that seem really counterintuitive for what Senran Kagura seems to be shooting for, but overall it's a pretty fun time, and I enjoyed my 20-ish hours of playtime. I'll definitely be spending more time with it as I go for the Platinum Trophy, which basically requires the player to max out all weapons and characters. Yeah, that one's gonna take a while. But I still got 2 other games to cover first. I give Senran Kagura Peach Beach Splash 6.5 peaches out of 10. Senran Kagura Burst Renewal is a reimagining of the original DS game, fitting more into the modern Dynasty Warriors vein of Estival Versus. Honestly, this might be one of the best remakes of any game, at least that I've ever seen. I haven't played through the original Senran Kagura, but it's clear just by googling it that there was a lot of love put into Burst Renewal, from the modern graphical style to the loads of additional content as well as its DLC. Now, I will be the first to say that not all of this DLC is exactly what I would professionally refer to as worth buying, but I did get a nice bundle of DLC with my copy, including Yumi from the newer games as a playable character with 10 missions just to tell her own story. I don't have any of the other character DLC, though I may pick up Miyabi as she is one of the best girls, but if they all feature 10 more missions to play through, then that's some pretty impressive additional content for the price. Speaking of which, I wouldn't say this game has nearly as much content as PBS, but that's not to suggest it's lacking in that department either. On top of a plethora of extra missions that offer some unique challenges like timed and endurance fights as well as unique bosses, Burst Renewal features 2 storylines, one for the Hanzo squad and one for Hebisho. And like PBS, they aren't always narratively congruent. This kind of structure is always going to bother me because I honestly can't figure out what story events are canon, which makes it really difficult to care about what happens, which is especially bad for a game so focused on characters. Some of you will probably tell me the developers confirm this, that, or the other, to which my response is simply death of the author. Okay, I'll leave it at this. When it comes to what's canon in a story, the only thing that truly matters is what the story gives us. Headcanon exists as a personal justification or even recontextualization, and an author's input can have value, but ultimately, if the canonicity of the happenings within a work are muddled, then the story is going to suffer, and the audience will become detracted. I do think Burst Renewal's stories have major highlights. In fact, I'll argue the finales of both storylines are pretty damn good and have some satisfying payoffs. Being that this is a remake of the original, I was curious to see how these characters were going to be introduced, and overall, it's a pretty mixed bag. Some of these characters are written surprisingly well, and the story does a great job at times with showing the audience what they're all about, all the while setting up future story beats. Asuka and Homura's rivalry felt very silly and overly aggressive in PBS, but with Burst Renewal, there's a very organic build-up to their final battle. Asuka is established as being bound and determined to live up to her grandfather's legacy as a legendary shinobi. But when she meets Homura, a shinobi from the rival school Hebisho, Asuka is way out of her depth, and Homura is unimpressed. On the flip side, Homura is established as not really caring about her fellow Hebisho shinobi, and she only ever uses 6 of her 7 blades, with the 7th having a unique sheath. When characters ask about it, Homura basically says that there will come a time when she is ready to use it, but that time is not now, as the blade is devastatingly powerful. As well, each school possesses a powerful scroll that can be used to awaken an incredible power within a strong enough shinobi. I won't pretend that this stuff is exceptionally compelling, but the building blocks for the story between these two characters are all there. So when the climax of the story was finally happening, and these two were squaring off using the power of their respective scrolls and Homura unsheaths that 7th blade, I gotta be honest, it was pretty fucking badass. The rest of the cast is pretty hit or miss though. Haruka and Ikariga were pretty cool gameplay wise, and I like their sort of positions as mentors among their respective student bodies, but wow, Ikariga did not get much in the ways of missions. Oh, did I mention Ikariga is one of my favorite characters to play in this game? Can you figure out why? She has entered the realm of best girls for me, right alongside Miyabi, Rin, and Jasmine.
Hey Loveless, what about Daidoji?
What about Daidoji? I think what annoyed me more than Ikariga barely getting any missions was the overabundance of Hibari missions. Oh my god, I did not enjoy playing as this character. Every rivalry in this story sees a rematch or two, and on its own that's fine. It's a good way of conveying how the characters are growing as the story progresses, but whoever thought that fighting Haruka as Hibari in her own dedicated boss mission 7 million goddamn times was a good idea needs to be fired. And the fights don't even get mixed up either, it's literally just fighting Haruka again and again and again and again! What the fuck? And you know, in moderation, I think playing as Hibari is fine. Not good, but fine. She's a very close-range character, and that can be difficult to work with when trying to fight massive hordes of enemies. But I don't think I would have minded as much if literally over a third of the 40 Hanzo missions weren't hers. It got to a point where I was just sick of playing her and would mindlessly use her broken-ass butt slam attack to build burst meter and clear the area with the broken-ass burst attack. And to be clear, I did try and get good with her, and not just her, but every character, but Jesus Christ. Hibari was by far the least fun to play. I get that for some people, her playstyle will be fun, and you know what, that's fine, we all have preferences, that's cool. But I don't think anyone can argue that it's a major problem when one of the more minor characters has so many goddamn dedicated missions. So alright, I mentioned a couple of the mechanics just then when talking about She Who Must Not Be Named, and if you ask me, the Dynasty Warriors style gameplay is where the series really seems to shine mechanically. Typically within Dynasty Warriors style games, there isn't much in the ways of depth. I remember being pretty bored when playing games like Hyrule Warriors and Fate Extella Umbral Star on the Wii U and Vita respectively, because it felt like those games did very little to mix things up and were generally lacking in depth and challenge, at least in the brief time that I spent playing them. Burst Renewal has a lot to offer on the mechanical side though, and it does a great job at balancing out the horde fights with the one-on-one shinobi fights. I will say that while fun at first, the horde fights did get a bit samey. They introduce different types of enemies, but they do very little in the ways of mixing things up, and there's never more to introducing them than just seeing them for the first time, I guess. For the most part, the enemy types are fine. You have your typical big strong boys and the smaller jobbers, however there is one enemy type that I fucking despise. You see these cunts with the bows and arrows? You're just going to be chasing them until you finally have them cornered and can land a blow to start a combo. That is not fun. It will never be fun. Devil May Cry 3 tried that shit with the Enigmas and they fucking sucked. Stop doing this. If you're a developer of a hack and slash game and you're watching this video right now, for some fucking reason, don't fucking do this shit. All it does is kill the pacing of a fight. So alright, the horde fights range from mindlessly monotonous to pretty enjoyable, but the shinobi fights are where this game really shines. These fights are very well done, with literally every shinobi girl having their own unique movesets and behaviors. There are definitely some similar attacks, for instance they all tend to have some sort of stinger, but aside from that sparing commonality, each shinobi feels like they pose a unique threat, and it goes a long way in making them stand out as characters. When it comes to hack and slash games, one-on-one fights tend to be the highlight for a lot of players, myself included. The same can definitely be said for Burst Renewal. What makes these fights so engaging and just fun is how they not only require the player to be able to string together combos and strike when given the opportunity, but they also require that the player learn their opponent's behaviors, respect them, and play around them. Rushing in and button mashing will only see the player getting punished, and it's imperative that the player learn not only to block, but parry as well. Most shinobi attacks can be blocked, but others will need to either be dodged or parried. An attempted block will see the player's guard being broken, leaving them staggered and helpless. Blocks also can't be spammed in an attempt to get easy parries, thanks to the cooldown that maintains a certain length of time between each attempted block. Remember how in Metal Gear Rising you could just kinda spam the block? Yeah, this is the exact opposite of that. However, the exact same rule set applies to the enemy shinobi guards as well. Learning just what attacks break enemy guard can allow the player to gain a tremendous advantage over their foes when the opportunity presents itself. I've only put about 15 hours of playtime into Burst Renewal, so I'm not going to pretend to be some kind of expert on its systems, but I was pleasantly rewarded for my experimentation with certain commands and combinations. Guard canceling was by far one of the most advantageous techniques I learned in my playtime. Guarding is, from what I gather, a medium to high priority input, meaning that it can be used to interrupt all kinds of attack animations. And even though guards can't be spammed back to back, attacks can be used to instantly follow an attempted guard, making the guard a perfect chain for almost any combination of attacks. Obviously, there are multiple attacks that guarding won't cancel, such as supers, transformations, and bursts, but that's perfectly fine. The application of guard canceling is pretty insane. It won't keep the player character suspended in the air indefinitely, but it can still be used to great effect for extending aerial combos. When it comes to grounded combos, however, guard canceling becomes a godlike tool for, ironically enough, shattering enemy guards. It's not just the specific attacks that can break guards, but also just overwhelming one's foe with an onslaught of attacks. Guard canceling light attack combos means the player can maintain a constant barrage until their enemy's guard has been shattered, leaving them fatigued and susceptible to whatever attack the player feels like following up with. I mean, just watch me lock Katsuragi the fuck down in this clip. There's also the issue of aerial rave. It's really dumb. Each character can power up into their shinobi form, granting them some new moves and generally making them stronger. It also heals the character completely, which is useful in a strategic sense for the player, but it also gives the shinobi bosses their own phases, in its own way. The shinobi form is really cool, but there's one thing that it does that's just absurd, and that's allow the player to aerial rave up to half a dozen times. So, okay, 2 or 3 aerial rave combos that can be chained together with some degree of skill, a reasonable buff, I think. Half a fucking dozen where you can literally dash to whatever enemy you're targeting, basically gluing you to them? Yeah, that's a bit excessive. Shinobi bosses have counters to deal with this, but they're not difficult to work around, and the ability to utterly slaughter mobs makes them a bit too trivial. What's especially weird about this in Burst Renewal is the fact that this existed in Estival Versus as well. And it was way harder in Estival Versus to chain rave shinobi bosses, so what the fuck happened? Overall, the combat in Burst Renewal is really good, but there's just a few too many ways that it can be easily broken that don't really sit well with me. Burst Renewal also offers a leveling system that's okay. It's about as shallow as a puddle, though it has a bit more going on than Estival and PBS, but at least the progression itself functions at an effective pace. Completing missions earns the player experience in 2 of 3 categories: character level and the yin or yang tree. Character levels are pretty straightforward. They determine how much health and damage the character being played deals. Pretty standard. The yin and yang trees essentially act as rewards for the character being played depending on what mode was being played. There are 5 levels per tree, with each level granting the character a new ability such as guard breaking with heavy attacks and damage gating when above 20% health. When going into a mission, the player has the option between standard and frantic modes, with experience drawn from each of them going towards the yang and yin trees respectively. Frantic mode is really high octane, with the player taking significantly more damage but also dealing way more damage to compensate. It's a lot of fun, and I'm glad that it's linked to a reward system of its own. I just wish the reward system was a bit more complex. I don't know, it just feels so straightforward in terms of benefits, and some of these benefits are extremely powerful, so it just feels like I'm not really earning them so much as just eventually being handed them. It feels like something as insanely powerful as guard breaking with heavies should require the player to complete a certain challenge to unlock, rather than just eventually getting it after playing the character enough times. The last thing I want to touch on in Burst Renewal is the character customization. I get that with it being a remake of the first game, and featuring less characters than Estival Versus or PBS, it was kind of bound to have less in terms of unlocks, but man, this was a way bigger step down than I was expecting. Don't get me wrong, there's still loads that anyone can do to dress up characters how they like, especially as they unlock more and more, but this game would have definitely benefited from having some of the cosmetic DLCs just being featured or added into the base game for free. The customization isn't bad, but it's noticeably lacking compared to Estival Versus and PBS. Overall, Burst Renewal was a really fun time, and it makes for a pretty strong standard for the series moving forward. Well, that is, if it does. More on that later. It definitely has its issues, but the gameplay is really damn polished and surprisingly engaging on a deeper mechanical level. I suppose it is worth bearing in mind that I generally stuck to hard mode, as the standard difficulty was rarely challenging and easy mode doesn't even require the use of a brain or a second hand in order to play, so take that how you will. But yeah, I had a blast playing it. It's certainly no DMC, but I don't really think it needs to be. It plays to its strengths and has a wide enough gap between the skill floor and skill ceiling that anyone could stick with it for at least a few dozen hours. Even though I've already got the Platinum trophy, there's still plenty left for me to do. Senran Kagura Burst Renewal is just a really solid game overall. I recommend it for anyone that enjoys a good Dynasty Warriors style hack and slash. I give it 7.5 bursts out of 10. So after PBS and Burst Renewal, I was pretty excited to get into Estival Versus. As it turns out, Estival Versus is a surprising step down. I wouldn't say I had a bad time, but PBS has such an edge on Estival in regards to content, and Burst Renewal is just way more mechanically complex. And there are some issues that I feel are really magnified regarding the story mode. This is more of a general criticism, but Senran Kagura cutscenes are not exactly what I would call well-directed. You can expect to be looking at one of 3 screens at a time for quite a while before finally getting to play again. Provided you don't just skip the cutscene altogether. You'll either be reading through page after page after page after page after page after page after page of text that goes on for way too damn long, or you'll be looking at a well-drawn shot that depicts what's going on in the scene, or you'll be watching characters standing in front of the screen with little in the ways of animation going on. This is just baffling to me. I'm not saying I'm against cutscenes being long. There are some games with exceptional cutscenes that can easily keep a player engaged throughout their duration. Hell, you're listening to a guy that loves Hideo Kojima games, if that tells you anything. But I need for stuff to be happening in order for me to be engaged to begin with. Senran Kagura just doesn't have that. The plot itself moves at a snail's pace and is heavily reliant on the character work to keep the audience engaged. That alone isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it isn't helped by the fact that the character work ranges from cringeworthy to decent. And the characters are only ever presented via stilted animations or the occasional really well done art. I can't really comment on the quality of the voice acting since I myself don't speak Japanese, but I can say that the voices themselves range from pleasant on the ears to making me wish I was hearing nails on chalkboard. And I just don't enjoy sitting there for so long watching characters in singular positions talk for so damn long. Characters being mostly physically stagnant isn't a problem, but the devs are trying to get these characters across as full of life, energy, and having unique personalities, which just doesn't work that well when they're all standing around very awkwardly and emoting so little, especially when it comes to facial expressions. I won't call this praise, but one edge that the story of Estival does have over PBS and Burst is how there's a very clear and laid out canon. Thank God. There's one story mode in Estival, and it makes things so much easier to keep track of. Not only that, but the focus allows the story a consistency that the other 2 titles simply lack. I won't say this makes the story great, but it is worth noting after having played the other 2. Story aside, I think Estival Versus is hands down the best when it comes to handling its characters, at least in regards to the gameplay and presentation. There is so much in the ways of customization, and like Burst Renewal, Estival Versus gives each and every character their own weapon to help them stand out. This is especially impressive given the sheer size of the roster. It's on par with PBS, but unlike PBS, every character manages to feel unique in terms of how they're presented and how they play, ultimately giving this roster the advantages of both PBS and Burst, but the shortcomings of neither. This goes a long way in helping the game to maintain its replayability. As far as general modes and content, Estival is somewhere between PBS and Burst, but I feel like the edge ultimately goes to Estival Versus for its sheer variety in characters. I also really want to give a shout out to this game's soundtrack. I generally enjoy the OST of the other games, but Estival Versus has some fucking bangers. I'm not a compositional savant, so I'm not going to try and sit you down and tell you how well the harmonies synchronize to form a sound or whatever the fuck that establishes a mood or whatever, but it's been a while since a main menu track was so good that I just sat there vibing to it. As far as combat goes, Estival Versus is pretty solid. The sheer variety between the characters goes a long way in adding to how much there is to learn, though I will say that in terms of mechanical depth, Estival is a bit lacking after having played BR. That might be more of a compliment to Burst for managing to one-up Estival's combat despite being a remake of a much simpler game, but you'd think that Estival would manage at least a bit more in terms of technical mechanics. Burst just has so much more going on to the point that it almost feels redundant to even go back to Estival at times. That's not to say the combat in Estival is bad, just that Burst Renewal is noticeably more polished. Balancing is also a bit of an issue in Estival. I'll always credit this game for the sheer variety in its characters, but the more you put on the scale, the harder it's going to be to balance, and the metas are ultimately inevitable. I won't give a game too hard of a time for having the balance lean more in favor towards certain characters, especially as the roster increases in size, but when my first ever 1,000-hit combo comes from the very first time I use a character, I think it's safe to say the game could have done with a bit more fine-tuning. It's not a major issue, but it's a bit noticeable. Estival Versus is definitely a mixed bag in many respects, but overall I'd say I had a pretty good time with it. It lacks the mechanical complexity of Burst Renewal and the sheer amount of content offered in PBS, and I know I probably sound like I've been way harder on it than the others, but I think overall the package is a solid middle ground of the respective strengths of PBS and Burst. It's still a fun time to play, and there's definitely plenty of content to keep the player invested for however long they like. I give it 6 festivals out of 10. Senran Kagura is a bizarre franchise, and that's part of the reason that I'm so interested in it. So far, the franchise has tackled over half a dozen genres, including the Dynasty Warriors horde-focused hack-and-slash styles of Burst Renewal and Estival Versus, the third-person shoot-'em-up style of PBS, an ecchi dating sim, a rhythm game, a phone game, 2D side-scrolling, and even a fucking pinball game. The franchise has also bled over into crossovers with other games in their own genres, including BlazBlue Cross Tag. That's just so cool to me. Hell, I'd also be down for a Senran Kagura 2D fighter. That sounds kick-ass. It's a shame that the franchise is on ice at the moment due to Sony's increasingly strict content regulations. I don't know what the current state of SK7 is internally, but I look forward to all that it has to offer and hope the best for the studios that have made these games possible. Apparently the studio wants SK7 to be a hack-and-slash, which makes sense given the success of Estival and Burst. If we could get a hack-and-slash style game with greater mechanical depth than Burst Renewal, greater character variety than Estival Versus, and even more content than PBS, Senran Kagura 7 might be one hell of a game. But for now, I suppose that's all I've got for today. Like I said, I'm definitely not a hardcore Senran Kagura fan, but these games don't really get much in the ways of coverage, and I just find them to be a ton of fun. This has been a fun video to make, though I'm not sure if I'd call it a one-off, at least not long-term. I don't really have any interest in reviewing the other games in the franchise, but I would love to review SK7 sometime in the hopefully not too distant future. I'm not sure how much reach this video will ultimately get, but if you consider yourself more of a hardcore fan, I'd certainly appreciate your input in the comments. But anyways, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching, and remember, Jasmine is the best girl. Alright, so I've decided that I'm actually going to give a couple of these side games a go, because I saw them on the Nintendo store on Switch, and I've got to give them a try to see. I gotta just see. I don't know what's going on. She just kind of grabbed my hand. Like, ma'am, that's mine, actually. Yeah, I don't really know what to expect. I don't think I've ever played a dating game. Actually, no, that's not true. I played, Mr. Masagi on the PS4 because it was an easy platinum trophy and it was hilarious. So please, help me search myself. What? My hands, they're not that warm. I've been told my hands are soft. Chicks dig it, but I don't know about warm. I haven't done anything in a little while that would make them warm, you know what I mean? Whoa, when did you get that clothing on? I don't know if you noticed, but I feel a lot slimmer these days. Well, I'm glad. Good for you. You know, it's a good thing when you work out and it starts to pay off. Soothe her by caressing her intimately. Her reaction will change depending on where you touch. Yeah, I can imagine. Pet. Let's just hold hands. Let's just hold hands like a good Christian couple. I get the feeling the game wants me to do something. Oh my god, I'm making music. So, where was I? Oh yeah. Doctors, believe me, all that I see, absolutely all I gotta live. I gotta die. Otherwise, body my holding. Alright, what does this do? What is... I think I'm gonna go back to playing Pokemon now. Alright, so that was an experience. Let's try the pinball game. What could they possibly do to make a pinball game into a Senran Kagura game? Alright, let's go. Pinball game, baby! I got a shiny Aerodactyl in Pokemon Go earlier, so I'm feeling pretty good about my luck, my chances, you know? She's covered head to toe in fur like a dog. Oh no, Riona's a furry. I knew there was a reason I didn't like her. So I brewed up a body-changing concoction. Beastall in the arcade bathroom. Why is there an arcade bathroom? You know, if I saw a green liquid in a bathroom, I don't think I would be touching it. Oh my god. No. No!